Some places do not stay abandoned because people forget them, the old man at the gas station said quietly. Some places stay abandoned because they remember too much. Caleb Ward did not answer. He simply tightened his gloves against the bitter Montana wind and looked through the frosted windshield toward the hill above Black Hollow. The church stood there alone beneath a pale gray sky, surrounded by snowdrifts nearly 4 feet deep. Its steeple leaned slightly to one side, and every window was covered in white frost thick enough to hide whatever remained inside. Beside him, Rex sat perfectly still in the passenger seat of the old Ford pickup, ears raised toward the distant building. The German shepherd had been restless ever since they crossed into town. Caleb noticed it immediately. Rex had served beside him overseas years ago, and the dog never reacted without reason. "It's just an old church," Caleb muttered softly as he grabbed the keys from the ignition. But even he did not fully believe it. The church had cost him $900 at a county auction. $900 for nearly 2 acres of frozen land, a collapsing chapel, and a building nobody in town wanted to speak about. Most people would have laughed at the purchase. Caleb almost had himself. Yet after years of sleeping in cheap motels, repairing fences for strangers, and drifting from one lonely town to another, the abandoned church felt strangely familiar. Wounded things recognized each other. Snow crunched beneath Caleb's boots as he approached the front doors. The cold bit through his coat instantly, sharp enough to sting his lungs. Rex walked ahead carefully, his breath forming pale clouds in the darkening afternoon air. The dog stopped halfway up the steps. His body became rigid. Caleb frowned. "What is it, boy?" Rex did not bark. He stared directly at the church doors. Then slowly, almost nervously, he let out a low growl deep in his throat. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The sound echoed strangely across the empty hillside. Wind pushed through the dead pine trees surrounding the property, carrying a soft whistle that almost sounded human for half a second before fading. Again. Caleb unlocked the doors anyway. The hinges screamed as the church opened into darkness. The air inside was even colder than outside. Rows of old wooden pews sat untouched beneath layers of dust and frost. Moonlight slipped through crack-stained glass windows, painting faded colors across the icy floorboards. Somewhere deeper inside the chapel, water dripped slowly. Rex stepped inside first, moving carefully between the pews. Caleb followed with a flashlight in one hand. The beam shook slightly, though he blamed the cold for that. At the center of the chapel, Rex suddenly stopped. Completely still. His ears lifted. Then Caleb heard it too. At first, he thought it was only wind beneath the floorboards. But the sound grew clearer. Soft. Distant. Almost impossible to understand. Singing. Caleb froze beside the old altar while the sound drifted upward through the frozen church floor like a hymn trapped beneath layers of ice. Rex lowered himself slowly onto the ground and stared at the floor beneath them. Then the wooden boards trembled very slightly under Caleb's boots. And somewhere deep below the church, the singing began again. Caleb did not sleep that night. Long after the singing faded beneath the chapel floor, he remained sitting on one of the frozen pews with an old lantern glowing beside him while Rex stayed near the altar, watching the same spot without moving. Outside, snow tapped softly against the stained glass windows as wind rolled down from the mountains in long hollow breaths. Every few minutes, the old church creaked somewhere above them, the sound of ancient wood shrinking against the cold. But beneath those ordinary noises was something Caleb could not explain. The silence inside the church no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Around 3 in the morning, he finally stood and walked slowly toward the altar again. His boots echoed across the frozen floorboards while the lantern light flickered across patches of ice spreading between the cracks in the wood. The closer he came to the center of the chapel, the colder the air became. He could actually see his breath thickening in front of him. Rex lifted his head immediately. The German shepherd let out a soft whine and pressed one paw carefully against the floor. Caleb knelt beside him and placed his own hand against the wood. Instantly, cold shot through his fingers so sharply it almost burned. The floor felt like solid ice beneath the surface. Yet the church furnace was running full strength. Caleb could hear it rumbling through the walls behind him. "That is not normal," he whispered quietly. Rex suddenly turned his head toward the rear hallway of the church. His ears stood upright. Then came the sound again. Faint at first. Almost too soft to notice. Singing. Not words exactly. More like a low trembling hymn carried upward through layers of frozen earth. Caleb felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. The sound did not feel threatening. If anything, it felt sad. Deeply sad. Like someone remembering something they could never let go of. Rex slowly backed away from the altar and began walking toward a narrow side corridor Caleb had barely noticed before. The hallway disappeared into darkness beside the old choir room. Caleb grabbed the lantern and followed. Frost covered the walls there more heavily, turning the narrow corridor pale white. Old photographs hung crooked along the wooden panels, most too faded to recognize. But one picture still remained clear beneath the frost. Caleb stopped when he saw it. A group of children standing outside the church in heavy winter coats, smiling beside a tall priest. Snow covered the ground around them. At the bottom of the photograph, barely visible beneath cracked glass, were the words Winter Festival 1958. Rex suddenly growled. Low. Uneasy. Caleb turned toward the end of the hallway where an old door stood slightly open. Cold air drifted from inside. Much colder than anywhere else in the church. He pushed the door wider with one hand. The room beyond appeared to be an abandoned storage area filled with broken chairs, hymn books, and collapsed shelves buried beneath years of dust. But one thing immediately caught his attention. The floor inside the room was completely frozen solid. Thick ice covered every inch from wall to wall, smooth and pale beneath the lantern light. And directly in the center of the ice was a perfect circle about 3 feet wide where no frost had formed at all. Rex stopped at the edge of it and stared downward without blinking. Then the singing beneath the church suddenly became louder than before. The singing rolled upward through the frozen room like wind moving across the surface of a distant lake, low and trembling, almost gentle enough to make Caleb doubt he was truly hearing it. Yet Rex heard it too. The German shepherd remained frozen beside the strange circle in the ice, his eyes locked downward as though something beneath the floor had captured his complete attention. Caleb slowly crouched beside him again, lantern shaking slightly in his hand. The circle in the ice was perfectly smooth, nearly black beneath the thin glow of light. Unlike the rest of the room, no frost touched its surface. Caleb carefully reached one gloved hand toward it. The instant his fingers brushed the dark patch, the singing stopped. Silence swallowed the room so suddenly that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat. Rex lifted his head sharply. Then somewhere deep below them came a single hollow sound. Knock. Caleb stood immediately. The lantern flame flickered hard against the cold draft moving through the room. For several seconds neither he nor Rex moved at all. Then another sound rose from beneath the floorboards. Knock. Knock. Not loud. Not violent. But deliberate. Caleb backed slowly toward the doorway while Rex remained near the circle, watching it carefully. No, Caleb whispered under his breath. There is nobody under there. He tried saying it again in his mind, but the words felt weaker the second time. Outside, dawn had begun turning the church windows pale blue. Caleb spent the remainder of the morning searching every hallway and storage room inside the building. He found old hymnals, broken candles, collapsed shelves, and decades of dust, but no entrance beneath the church floor. By sunrise, exhaustion pressed heavily behind his eyes. Still, he could not leave the mystery alone. Around 8 o'clock, he drove down into town with Rex sitting quietly beside him. Black Hollow looked even smaller in daylight. A single grocery store stood beside. The highway, along with a diner, a hardware store, and a gas station facing the snow-covered road. Smoke drifted from chimneys while old pickup trucks sat buried beneath layers of frost. Yet despite the peaceful appearance, Caleb noticed something strange immediately. People stared at him. Not with curiosity. With concern. By the time he stepped into the diner, the room had already gone silent. An elderly waitress slowly poured coffee into a chipped mug while studying him carefully. "You are staying up at the church?" she finally asked. Caleb nodded once. Several people exchanged uneasy looks. Nobody smiled. "Did you hear it yet?" an older man near the window asked quietly. Caleb paused before answering. "Hear what?" The old man lowered his eyes toward the table. "The singing." The diner became completely silent again. Even the waitress stopped moving. Caleb felt cold despite the heat inside the room. "What exactly is that place?" he asked. The waitress looked toward the snowy street outside before speaking softly. "People used to say the church protected something during the winter of 1958. "Protected what?" Caleb asked. But she only shook her head. "Nobody really knows anymore." At that moment Rex suddenly stood from beneath the table and let out a low uneasy growl toward the front window. Caleb turned immediately. Across the street stood an elderly woman wrapped in a long gray coat. She was staring directly at him through the falling snow. The moment their eyes met, she slowly raised one trembling hand toward the hill above town where the church stood hidden beneath the storm clouds. Then she mouthed four quiet words Caleb could somehow understand perfectly even through the glass. "It is waking up again." The snowstorm reached Black Hollow before sunset. Thick white flakes swept across the empty roads while dark clouds swallowed the mountains surrounding the town. Caleb drove slowly back toward the church with both hands tight on the steering wheel, unable to stop thinking about the old woman outside the diner. "It is waking up again." The word stayed with him the entire drive uphill. Beside him, Rex remained unusually alert, watching the road. Ahead through the falling snow without resting once. By the time the church finally appeared through the storm, the temperature had dropped below 10 degrees. Wind slammed against the old building hard enough to rattle the stained glass windows. Caleb stepped out of the truck and immediately felt the strange silence surrounding the property again. No birds. No distant traffic. Nothing except the sound of snow scraping across frozen ground. Rex jumped from the passenger seat and hurried toward the church doors before Caleb even reached them. The dog was pulling now, impatient and tense. "Easy," Caleb muttered while unlocking the entrance. The moment the doors opened, a wave of freezing air rushed outward from inside the chapel. Caleb stopped instantly. The furnace had completely shut down. The church was colder than the outdoors now. Frost covered the pews like fresh snow, and thin sheets of ice stretched farther across the wooden floor than before. Caleb could even see crystals forming along the walls beneath the stained glass windows. Yet the strangest part was the sound. Silence. The singing had vanished completely. Rex moved quickly down the center aisle toward the altar. His nails clicked sharply against the frozen boards while Caleb followed with the lantern. Every few feet, the church groaned softly around them, old wood shifting beneath the pressure of the cold. Rex stopped near the altar again and sniffed the floor. Then suddenly he turned and bolted toward the narrow hallway leading to the frozen storage room. Caleb hurried after him. The temperature dropped even more the closer they came. His breath rolled heavily in front of his face now, thick as smoke. When he reached the doorway, he froze. The room had changed. The strange dark circle in the ice was larger now, nearly 5 feet wide. And inside the black surface, something reflected beneath the frozen layer far below. Caleb slowly lowered the lantern closer. At first he thought it was only trapped air beneath the ice. Then he realized he was looking at carved stone. A staircase. Hidden beneath the frozen floor. Rex let out a sharp bark and immediately began scratching near the edge of the circle. Ice cracked softly beneath his paws. Caleb grabbed an old shovel leaning against the wall and carefully chipped away at the thin layer surrounding the dark opening. It took nearly 20 minutes before enough ice broke free for him to see clearly. Beneath the floor was not dirt. It was a hollow chamber descending into darkness beneath the church. Caleb stared in disbelief. "There is no way this place was built over something like this," he whispered. Rex suddenly backed away from the opening with a low uneasy growl. Then the singing returned. Louder than ever before. This time Caleb could hear actual voices woven beneath the sound, soft and distant like a choir buried beneath snow. The lantern flickered violently. Wind rushed upward from the hidden stairwell, though there should have been no air moving beneath solid ground. Caleb slowly stepped backward while staring into the darkness below the church. And then, from somewhere deep beneath the ice, a warm golden light briefly flickered once inside the hidden chamber before disappearing again. Caleb did not remember deciding to go down the hidden staircase. Later, he would only remember the feeling that something beneath the church had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally listen. The storm outside deepened as snow hammered against the old building, but inside the frozen storage room, everything had become strangely still. Even the wind seemed quieter now. The dark opening beneath the ice breathed cold air upward from below while the faint golden light flickered again somewhere deep in the hidden chamber. Rex stood at the edge without moving, ears raised high, every muscle tense beneath his thick fur. Caleb grabbed the lantern tightly and stepped carefully onto the stone stairs. Frost coated every step descending beneath the church. The deeper he went, the quieter the world above became until only the sound of his breathing and the distant singing remained. The staircase curved downward nearly 15 feet before opening into a narrow underground tunnel lined with old stone walls. Caleb stopped immediately. The air below felt warmer than the church above. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but warmer in a way that made no sense beneath frozen ground. Thin candles sat along the tunnel walls, melted decades ago into strange shapes beneath layers of dust. Rex walked ahead slowly, his paws silent against the ancient stone floor. The singing echoed softly through the tunnel now, clearer than before. Caleb could finally recognize the sound as a hymn. Old-fashioned. Gentle. Almost peaceful. Yet there was no source. No movement. No people. Only the endless sound drifting through the underground darkness like memory itself had learned how to sing. About 30 feet ahead, the tunnel widened into a hidden chamber beneath the church. Caleb raised the lantern higher and froze in disbelief. The room looked untouched by time. Wooden shelves lined the walls filled with books, sealed jars, blankets, and supplies buried beneath thick dust. A rusted iron stove stood near the far wall beside several small beds carefully arranged side by side. And above them all hung dozens of faded drawings pinned carefully across the stone walls. Children's drawings. Caleb stepped closer slowly. Snowmen. Churches. Mountains. Families holding hands beneath bright yellow suns. Simple pictures drawn with colored pencils long ago. Rex moved toward one corner of the room and lowered himself quietly onto the floor beside an old wooden desk. The singing suddenly faded until only silence remained. Caleb approached the desk carefully. A leather journal rested on top beside a tarnished silver cross. The cover was cracked from age, but one name remained visible beneath the dust. Pastor Elias Mercer. Caleb opened the journal slowly. Most pages had yellowed with time, but the handwriting was still readable beneath the lantern light. December 17, 1958. The storm grows worse tonight. The children are frightened. I told them the singing means they are not alone. Caleb frowned. He turned another page. December 19. The town believes the children disappeared in the storm. For now, it must remain that way. Caleb stared at the words while cold crept slowly through his chest. Rex suddenly lifted his head toward the far side of the chamber. A low uneasy growl rolled from deep in his throat. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. At the back wall stood another door partially hidden behind hanging blankets. Unlike everything else underground, this door looked newer, stronger. And beneath it, thin lines of warm golden light glowed softly across the stone floor while somewhere behind the door, the singing quietly began again. The golden light beneath the hidden door pulsed softly against the stone floor like the glow of a distant lantern moving somewhere beyond the wall. Caleb stood motionless inside the underground chamber while the singing drifted quietly through the cold air around him. Rex remained close beside the desk, watching the hidden doorway without blinking. The dog was no longer growling now. Instead, he seemed strangely calm, almost as if he recognized something beyond the door that Caleb could not yet understand. Slowly, Caleb stepped forward. Dust shifted beneath his boots while the old wooden floor creaked softly under the weight of years. The closer he came to the hidden doorway, the warmer the air became. It was not enough to melt the frost covering the stone walls, but enough to feel impossible beneath frozen ground. Caleb reached the blankets hanging over the doorway and carefully pushed them aside. Behind them stood a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron hinges darkened by age. The singing stopped the instant his fingers touched the handle. Silence filled the underground chamber again. Caleb hesitated for several seconds before slowly pulling the door open. Warm light spilled immediately into the room. Caleb narrowed his eyes in disbelief. Beyond the doorway was another hidden chamber, larger than the first and far better preserved. Oil lamps lined the walls, their small flames somehow still burning with soft golden light despite what had to be decades underground. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar wood and candle smoke instead of dust and ice. Thick blankets covered several wooden cots arranged neatly against one wall while shelves overflowed with canned food, books, medicine bottles, and old winter coats sized for children. Caleb stepped carefully inside while Rex followed close behind. The room felt less like a hiding place and more like a sanctuary frozen in time. Then Caleb noticed the mural painted across the far stone wall. Children holding hands beneath a bright golden sun while snow fell around a small church on a hill. Beneath the painting, written in faded black paint, were the words "The storm cannot follow kindness forever." Caleb felt something tighten quietly inside his chest. He walked toward a small table near the mural where dozens of letters had been stacked carefully into neat bundles tied with faded ribbon. Most were addressed only with first names. Emma. Jacob. Lily. Samuel. Children. Caleb picked up one envelope gently and unfolded the yellowed paper inside. "Thank you for keeping us safe during the storm. Mommy says we can finally go home next spring. Pastor Elias says fear only grows in dark places." Caleb lowered the letter slowly. The room suddenly felt unbearably quiet. Rex moved toward the corner of the chamber and sat beside a small rocking chair facing an old phonograph resting atop a wooden cabinet. The machine looked ancient but spotless, as though someone had cared for it recently. Caleb approached carefully. Beside the phonograph rested another journal written by Pastor Elias Mercer. Caleb opened it slowly beneath the warm lantern glow. January 3, 1959. The children are finally sleeping peacefully tonight. The singing beneath the church comforts them when the storms grow loud. I pray one day this place will no longer need to hide them. Caleb frowned and turned another page. February 10. If the town ever discovers what truly happened here, they will destroy this sanctuary. Some men fear truth more than winter itself. Caleb stared at the words while the room around him seemed to grow colder again. Then, from somewhere above them deep within the church, 3 heavy knocks echoed through the ceiling. Caleb looked upward instantly. Rex stood at once, ears raised sharply toward the sound. Another knock echoed overhead, louder this time. Snow drifted softly from the ceiling beams. Caleb slowly closed the journal while a terrible realization formed inside his mind. Someone else had just entered the church. The knocks echoed. Again through the ceiling above the hidden chamber, slow and heavy, followed by the distant sound of footsteps crossing the frozen chapel overhead. Caleb immediately lowered the lantern flame while Rex stood rigid beside him, ears pointed upward toward the church floor above them. The underground sanctuary suddenly felt much smaller. Caleb listened carefully. The footsteps moved across the chapel, paused for several seconds, then continued toward the narrow hallway leading to the frozen storage room. Whoever had entered the church knew exactly where to go. Snow drifted softly from the ceiling beams as the storm howled somewhere far above them. Caleb carefully stepped back from the hidden doorway and looked around the underground chamber for another exit. There had to be one. A place like this was never built with only a single staircase. Rex quietly walked toward the back wall beneath the mural and pressed his nose against the stone. Caleb followed quickly. At first he saw nothing unusual, but then the German shepherd pawed softly at a section of wall hidden behind old blankets hanging near the corner. Caleb pulled them aside and discovered another narrow wooden door nearly invisible against the stone. The handle resisted at first before slowly giving way with a soft creak. Cold air drifted through from the darkness beyond. Caleb raised the lantern carefully. A second tunnel stretched forward beneath the church, narrower than the first and partially frozen along the walls. "Good boy," Caleb whispered softly to Rex. The footsteps above suddenly stopped completely. Silence settled across the underground chambers. Caleb felt tension tighten through his chest. Whoever was upstairs was listening now too. Without wasting another second, he slipped into the hidden tunnel with Rex close behind. The passage curved gently beneath the frozen earth while the faint singing returned once more, softer now, almost distant again. Caleb noticed something strange as they moved deeper underground. The walls beside them were covered with names carved carefully into the stone. Emma. Jacob. Samuel. Lily. The same names from the letters upstairs. Some of the carvings were small and uneven, like they had been written by children many years ago. Others were larger, carved carefully by adult hands beside simple messages. Safe here. Storm passed. We survived. Caleb slowly brushed his fingers across the frozen stone while something heavy settled quietly inside him. The town had believed those children disappeared during the winter storm. But they had not vanished at all. They had been hidden here beneath the church. Protected. The tunnel finally opened into a small underground prayer room lit only by a single oil lamp still glowing softly on a wooden table. Caleb stopped immediately. The flame was fresh. Someone had lit it recently. Rex growled low beneath his breath. On the table rested another journal opened beside a steaming metal cup. Caleb stared at the steam rising slowly into the cold air. Somebody had been here moments ago. Then a calm voice spoke quietly behind him. Pastor Mercer always believed the church would call someone back eventually. Caleb turned sharply toward the darkness near the tunnel entrance. An elderly woman stepped slowly into the lantern light. It was the same woman from outside the diner. Snow covered her gray coat while her pale eyes reflected the warm glow of the oil lamp. Rex watched her carefully but did not bark. The woman looked toward the carved names along the walls before speaking again. "The children were never lost," she said softly. "The church hid them here during the storm while dangerous men searched the town above." Caleb stared at her silently. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The woman smiled sadly as the singing drifted faintly through the stone walls once more. "My name is Eleanor Mercer," she whispered. "And I was one of the children hidden beneath this church during the winter of 1958. Eleanor Mercer sat quietly beside the small oil lamp while snowstorms groaned through the earth above them. The warm light softened the deep lines across her face as she looked around the hidden prayer room with the expression of someone returning to a place that still carried pieces of her childhood. Rex slowly approached her and rested beside her chair without hesitation. Caleb noticed the change immediately. The German shepherd trusted her completely. Pastor Elias brought 7 of us down here during the winter storms, Eleanor said softly while tracing her fingers across one of the carved names in the wall. Most people believed we were orphans after the mine collapse outside town, but that was not true. Caleb listened carefully while the distant singing drifted once more through the tunnels beneath the church. Then why hide the children? He asked quietly. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the flickering oil lamp. Because some men from outside Black Hollow wanted the land beneath this church. Caleb frowned slightly. The land? Eleanor nodded. There is a natural spring running beneath the mountain. Warm water flows under the frozen ground all winter long. Pastor Elias believed that was why the church survived so many storms. But other people believed the spring was valuable. She paused for several seconds before continuing. Those men wanted the families gone so they could claim everything around the mountain. When several children disappeared after the storms, the town became terrified. Pastor Elias realized somebody was using the blizzards to scare people away. Caleb slowly remembered the hidden chamber filled with supplies, blankets, and letters. So he hid all of you here. Eleanor smiled faintly. Yes. He turned the church into a sanctuary beneath the snow. The singing grew louder again somewhere beyond the tunnels, low and trembling like distant voices carried through warm water. Caleb finally understood something important then. The sound was not supernatural at all. Wind from the underground spring must have been moving through the hidden tunnels beneath the church, creating the strange hymn-like echoes inside the frozen walls. But even understanding it scientifically did not remove the strange feeling surrounding the place. Some mysteries still carried something deeper than explanation. Eleanor slowly stood and walked toward the prayer room wall where another faded mural had nearly disappeared beneath time. It showed Pastor Elias standing beside children beneath falling snow while golden light rose from beneath the church floor. After the winter ended, most of us left Black Hollow, she whispered. Pastor Elias made certain every child found a safe home somewhere else. Caleb looked at her carefully. Why come back now? Eleanor's eyes glistened softly in the lantern light. Because the singing started again 3 weeks ago. Silence settled across the room. Rex suddenly lifted his head toward the tunnel leading back to the hidden sanctuary. His ears stiffened. Then came the sound of footsteps again. This time they were underground. Slow. Careful. Moving closer through the tunnel behind them. Caleb immediately stepped forward protectively while Eleanor remained strangely calm. The footsteps stopped just beyond the lantern light. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then an elderly male voice drifted softly through the darkness. I told you someone would eventually hear the church calling again. A tall old man slowly emerged into the prayer room carrying another oil lantern. Thick snow covered his coat while frost clung to his silver beard. Caleb recognized him instantly. It was the old man from the diner. The same one who had asked whether Caleb heard the singing. The old man looked toward Caleb with tired eyes and gave a slow nod. Pastor Elias left the church to somebody long before he died, he said quietly. We have simply been waiting many years to discover who that person would be. The old man introduced himself as Walter Greene, and by the time the storm finally weakened near dawn, Caleb understood why nobody in Black Hollow had ever spoken openly about the church. Some secrets were never buried because people wanted to hide evil. Sometimes they were buried to protect kindness from being destroyed by fear. Walter sat quietly beside the oil lamp while Eleanor carefully unfolded another journal written by Pastor Elias. Rex rested near the prayer room entrance, calm for the first time since arriving at the church. The singing beneath the tunnels had softened now, blending almost peacefully with the sound of warm water flowing somewhere deep under the mountain. Caleb listened while Walter explained what happened after the winter of 1958. Pastor Elias had hidden several children underground during the storms because corrupt land buyers wanted local families gone from Black Hollow. Rumors of disappearances spread through town until people became too frightened to stay near the mountain. But Pastor Elias secretly protected the children beneath the church until safe homes could be found elsewhere. Afterward, he sealed the underground sanctuary and allowed the town to believe the children had vanished in the storm. He sacrificed his own reputation to keep everybody safe, Walter said quietly while staring into the lantern flame. People called him strange after that. Some even thought he had lost his mind because he claimed the church itself would protect the innocent. Eleanor smiled softly. But he was right. Caleb looked around the hidden chambers again. The preserved beds. The drawings. The letters. Everything beneath the church still carried warmth despite the frozen world above it. Why did the singing return now? Caleb finally asked. Walter exchanged a glance with Eleanor before answering. Because the church was never truly abandoned, he said. Every winter, somebody came back to maintain the sanctuary. My father did it first. Then me. Then Eleanor after I became too old. Caleb frowned slightly. Then why let the building fall apart? Walter smiled sadly. Because Pastor Elias left very specific instructions. Eleanor opened the final pages of the journal and handed it carefully to Caleb. The handwriting trembled slightly near the end, but the words remained clear beneath the lantern light. One day the church will sing again for someone who arrives not seeking riches, power, or fame, but simply searching for a place to rest his weary soul. When that person comes, the sanctuary must finally be returned to the world above. Caleb read the words twice in silence. Then he noticed something else folded inside the journal. A deed. The legal ownership papers for the church property and the surrounding land beneath the mountain. Signed decades earlier by Pastor Elias Mercer himself. Caleb slowly looked up. This was left for me. Walter nodded. Not specifically for you. For whoever the church chose. Caleb almost laughed softly at the strange sentence, yet somehow it no longer sounded impossible. Rex suddenly stood and walked quietly toward the tunnel leading back upstairs. Caleb followed him slowly through the underground passages while Walter and Eleanor remained behind in the prayer room. By the time Caleb climbed back into the frozen church, morning sunlight had begun pouring through the stained glass windows for the first time since the storm arrived. The ice covering the floorboards was melting. Thin streams of water glimmered beneath the warm light spilling across the chapel. Caleb stood silently near the altar while Rex settled beside him. Then the singing rose one final time beneath the church floor. Soft. Gentle. Peaceful. Not frightening anymore.